Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for starting your morning, afternoon, or evening with us at this super exciting and important event. Are we ready to go? Do we have all the participants on board? This is me to the technical team. I'm guessing the answer is yes.
Thanks for the answers. Yes.
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 Okay. Perfect. So welcome everyone. My name is Rashima Quatra. I'm the International Advocacy Advisor at RPSL, the Swedish Federation for LGBTIQ Rights. I'll be moderating the conversation today on banning conversion therapies, protecting LGBTIQ persons from harmful practices. This event is co-organized by Outright Action International, GATE, ILGA World, and RFSL. This event is being co-sponsored by Germany. And I think I'd like to start off very quickly by saying that we would very much like to firstly and especially thank Germany for the co-sponsorship of this event in parallel to the Human Rights Council, the 44th session of the Human Rights Council, recognizing that these are pretty unprecedented times and they have been new and difficult. And so this partnership is extremely more valuable than ever before. I'd also like to say that we have an incredible number of notable speakers today who will give insight into the harmful practice of so-called conversion therapy. And while we know that there's been an overwhelming research which clearly shows the inefficacy of conversion therapy on changing an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity or sex characteristics, states, religious groups, and anti-gay groups continue to endorse this harmful practice. And while there are many shapes and forms of conversion therapy, which can include aversion therapy, shock therapy, talk therapy, and other practices, there really is only just one reality, which is that these harmful practices have been discredited on multiple grounds. They've been debunked as faulty psychology that is driven by nothing more than anti-gay, anti-trans bigotry. And ultimately, these kinds of harmful practices contribute to the exclusion, discrimination, and even violence against people who are LGBTIQ. I hope that after this event, you will walk away with a better understanding of the human rights implications of these practices, as well as on concrete actions which can be taken to eliminate them. I'd like to start off our event today by sharing a video statement from the State Minister Michael Roth from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to welcome you today to this important event organized by Outright Action International, GATE, ILGA World, and RFSL on the so-called conversion therapies. This is a major issue we have to talk about because it's a serious violation of human rights. In this regard, I would like to thank Victor Madrigal-Borlos for his important work on so-called conversion therapies. His report gives very interesting and detailed insight into this issue from a global perspective and provides us with important material for our discussion today. So-called conversion therapies are wrong and harmful and cause immense suffering. Conversion therapy wrongly implies that sexual orientation and gender identity are illnesses. But sexual orientation and gender identity are part of who we are. They are part of our very identity. LGBTI people don't need therapy. They deserve respect, solidarity, and consideration. And this is our responsibility as governments. Governments have an obligation to respect, protect, and promote the human rights of all individuals. LGBTI rights are not nice to have. They are an essential part of human rights. We must repeat this over and over again. This is all the more important in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, which places additional pressure on the situation of LGBTI people, as they are often among the most marginalized and excluded groups. The report on conversion therapies of the independent expert SOGI also highlights how children and young people are disproportionately subjected to practices of conversion therapy. The report refers to a global survey suggesting that 4 out of 5 persons were 24 or even younger when receiving such treatment. Roughly half of them were minors. Children and young people are particularly vulnerable to the practice of conversion therapy, which is extremely harmful to their well-being and development. Conversion therapies are bad as such, but even worse when they target vulnerable people. I'm glad today to be able to announce that Germany has just passed a law on this subject. The new law prohibits so-called conversion treatments on minors under 18. It also prohibits advertising conversion treatments and offers counseling opportunities to affected affected. This law shall be seen as a clear signal to all LGBTI people in Germany that they are accepted as they are and respected as they are. We still have a long way to go on in our global struggle for equal rights for all, regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity. But we are determined to continue down this path together. That's why I would like to take this opportunity today to call on all governments to increase their efforts to protect the rights of LGBTI persons. Protection from so-called conversion therapies is part of this and must be offered worldwide. I want to thank all of you for your support and efforts in the ongoing struggle for the realization of the rights of LGBTI people and for the realization of universal human rights. I wish you a fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Daniele, for sharing that incredibly, powerful and supportive statement. I'd like to really applaud the German government for their recent banning of the promotion of conversion therapy and any practices under individuals who are under the age of 18. I especially appreciate that the state minister said that, that governments have an obligation to respect, protect, and promote the human rights of all people. And really, as he says it, LGBTI rights are not just nice to have, they're human rights. Let's move on to our first speaker, Victor Madrigal-Borloz, the UN independent expert for the protection of violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We're so happy to have you here, Victor. This is the first time that a UN mandate holder has devoted an entire report to shed light on conversion therapy. And your report contains submissions from over 100 individuals and reports. And of the many recommendations that you've come out with, it really concludes that there's a need to ban all forms of conversion therapy. Can you tell us more about the findings of your report and your recommendations?
Thank you very much, Rashima. I'm looking to you for an indication as to whether you can hear me well. Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's such a privilege to be here for many reasons. One of them is, of course, that this topic is very much in the current focus of interest of the mandate of the independent expert, given that I just presented the report relating to this issue to the Human Rights Council last week, and that I've been carrying out a number of efforts of outreach relating to this issue. But also, I want to welcome the fact that I am in this panel with such an impressive group of experts and activists on this area that it's truly humbling, because I acknowledge the wealth of knowledge that is surrounding this screen at the moment. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm also delighted to hear the words of our friend, the German minister. I think that it is an important element to understand that all forms of addressing, dissecting, analyzing, and really eradicating violence and discrimination, the whole work takes point of departure in certain fundamental building blocks. And one of those building blocks is unequivocal political statement of support of human rights of all persons, including freedom from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And I so much appreciate such a strong political signal from the German government. But I do have to say that I'm particularly delighted to relay the news today that our colleagues, some colleagues around the screen will be able to support me on this. When I presented my report last week to the Human Rights Council, despite certain challenges in the sequencing of the event, it appears to me that it came through very strongly that there is a significant critical mass of political support for the banning of conversion therapy in all of its forms. And this is important because I am convinced that this is not a task that any individual stakeholder can take on and of itself. This is a task that requires a wide coalition and very strong coalition thinking in order to be taken forward. Now, Rashima, thank you so much again for this invitation. I'm going to share my screen because I want to share with you a little bit of the way that this report came about. Now, this report is by no means ever intending to be a final word in relation to anything. It is a building block. Just like so many reports issued in the last 18 months are also equally important building blocks in this equation. And I will not rehearse a list of those reports because inevitably I would miss one and I would be in a lot of trouble for doing that. But around this screen, there's enough of you that actually have been responsible for them so that you will be talking about them. Each and every one of these is a building block on the foundation that is required on this issue. Why is it that I thought a report from the mandate of the independent expert could actually provide a useful element in relation to this? Well, the idea, of course, is that the mandate of the, Rashim, I'm looking at you for confirmation that you're looking, yes, thank you. The report very much takes into the point of departure the remit of the independent expert, which is, of course, to explore root causes of violence and discrimination, to provide visibility to the way and the shape and form that violence and discrimination takes around the world, and to refer to international human rights law. And of course, this within an important point of departure in the formulation of international human rights law. And as you very rightfully said, this is the first time that a mandate devotes a full report to this issue, but it is not the first time that special procedures, treaty bodies deal with issues relating to conversion therapy. The fundamental, one could say, material to build this building block was also provided by Juan Mendez when in his report a few years back actually referred to conversion therapy and manifested his concern in relation to the connection between conversion therapy and torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. So this already provided a little bit of a leeway as to what the mandate could provide in relation to this. And I came after a process that I'm going to very quickly describe. I came to the conclusion that the mandate could provide as a building block an examination as to whether the concept and the nature of conversion therapy could actually fall squarely into the definition of torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment as articulated under international human rights law. Now, we are very much aware of the degree to which the Convention Against Torture is a fundamental element in international human rights law. It's nearing universal ratification. It is truly a very strong reflection of what states consider in legal terminology to be undue behavior under international human rights law. And of course, when carrying out this examination, we are looking at acts causing severe pain and suffering, physical or mental, of course, intentionally inflicted with, and then of course there's a number of intentionalities identified historically as being under the foundation of torture. But after that, it mentions very clearly that it's for any reason based on discrimination of any kind and at the instigation or with the consent of acquiescence of public officers or persons acting in official capacities. And so these are the elements that were used to actually carry out the examination from the standpoint of my mandate in relation to this. Now, just to mention to you, of course, the idea of, as you can see, I'm not very good at doing pretty pictures, so I always draw by hand. The idea of my reports is pretty much always uniform. I begin with a literature review. I then go on to a basic document that is the basis of the call for inputs. I also create a consultation in Geneva that leads to a working theory, which usually goes to an expert meeting and leads to the drafting of the report. Now, for this desk research, over 200 studies and peer-reviewed articles were part of the desk research, which created the background document. And then I formulated the call for inputs. Already there, we see some of the elements that are going to be crucial in our strategic considerations as to what is the environmental scan in which we are working when developing strategic thinking as to how to go about this. If you look at the way in which this was actually responded, a huge majority will either come from Western European or other countries or global provenances. As a segment, but I won't call it a significant, I won't call it a critical mass, but clearly a significant segment coming from the Latin American, Eastern European, and Asia Pacific group, and then look at how worrisome only one submission out of 160 coming from Africa. That is, of course, enormously worrisome, and it already reveals a little bit of how knowledge is structured in relation to conversion therapy on these issues. You see there the breakdown, states overwhelmingly coming from the Western European or other groups, whereas for other regions of the world is most civil society and academia. Again, this is to me important because I think it reveals the environment when we're talking about this environmental scan. When building a coalition thinking, this will be important. The public consultation was held in Geneva, 9 February, very well attended by states and also by other stakeholders. I would highlight here the presence of a small number of faith-based organizations, which I thought was very meaningful and important taking this further. We then held an expert meeting on 28 February for the validation of working theory, collection of further inputs, definition of gaps and areas of dissent, and identification of consensus. And I want to thank so many people around my screen. I can see here that there's Ilga, there's Sharna, there's Ami. There's so many people that contributed, Outright International, of course, that contributed to this meeting. So warm thanks to all of them in relation to this. Rashima, I think I'm back now. And I will use the 2 or 3 minutes that I have left. I'm looking to you for indication whether I have 2 more minutes. To very quickly explain the consequences and findings of this report. Now, the report is structured in a way where it presents, first and foremost, an analysis of the populations that are affected by conversion therapy, but also what do we know about providers and promoters of conversion therapy. On this, not only did I benefit enormously from the wonderful reports that have been originated by institutions around our screen today, but also from what I believe is the largest survey ever carried out in relation to this issue under the auspices of the LGBT Foundation, over 8,000 people answered in relation to this. And what you can see coming out of this survey, and is very well documented in the report, is the fact that we are witnessing, first of all, practices that are fostered, promoted by a series of stakeholders, that confirming suspicions include faith-based organizations and health providers and family members, but also unsuspectedly and very worrisome, also include employers, and in some cases include even state authorities. My survey, and on this I benefited not only from Outright's research, but also ILGA World's research and the IRCT's research, the IFEX research, is that some states continue to actually condemn persons to conversion therapy under judicial processes, Dominica being one where that procedure is specifically provided by law. That's the first element in relation to this. The second is that there is clear documentation as to the extreme pain and suffering that is inflicted by conversion therapy. The plethora of suffering, I say in my report, it's not a literary catalog, it is a catalog of human misery, what we have before us. And the testimonies in relation to this, Outright's report is quite telling in relation to this, is heartbreaking at a human level, but meaningful also at a statistical level coming out of the wide survey that I was mentioning before. So there is no doubt that intense pain and suffering, both psychological and physical, are part of conversion therapy. And most importantly, there is significant concern that some of that is long-lasting trauma and in some cases irreparable harm. So that element was, of course, clearly documented through all of the research that we carried out. Now, other elements that were under examination for this issue were, of course, the intentionality. The report develops a theory coming out of all of these sources of evidence that there is, this is a long examined theory for the mandate relating to root causes. The root cause of conversion therapy can be found in the idea that there is such a thing as a desirable norm when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity. And that this desirable norm, I usually put that between brackets or between quotation marks, that this desirable norm condemns people who fall outside of it to some form of punishment, coercion, and in this case, to suffering revealed by conversion therapy. So what we know is that the intentionality is to actually make people fall into what is considered the desirable norm. If you examine sincerely the existence of that desirable norm under international human rights law, it bears no connection with the foundational principles of dignity and freedom from discrimination. And therefore, it is fundamental to understand that freedom from that idea of a desirable norm is a fundamental component of the compliance of Article 2 of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. And that is the foundation that the report takes. Two last words, and I will save many other things for the conversation. As a Bolivian friend of mine used to say, I will begin now to wrap up my first point, Rashima. No, I'm joking. I'm really ending. So very quickly, it is important to know that practices fall, my report classifies psychological approaches, medical approaches, and faith-based approaches. Other classifications talk about crime-like approaches, such as the heinously called, the heinously qualified corrective rape. But I chose to actually leave out of all of these practices all of those manifestations of violence, because I actually believe that at their foundation lies one of the other elements, and that of course they are gender-based forms of violence that are to be condemned everywhere and fall under different classifications. My conclusion is that any form of conversion therapy, meaning practices that take as point of departure that a person falling outside of what is considered to be a desirable norm for sexual orientation or gender identity needs to undergo a procedure to be changed in some way, shape, or form to that, are cruel, inhuman, and degrading in nature, because they take point of departure in a discriminatory treatment of any kind, as required by the Article 2 of the Convention Against Torture that we just examined, and because they take point of departure in a supposed inferiority of persons that fall outside of the desirable norm. Therefore, being degrading in nature, they're also quite unhuman because they ignore the reality that everybody has a sexual orientation and gender identity, and that the construction of artificial norms in relation to that is not inextricably linked to humanity. And finally, we cannot doubt that they are cruel, given the evidence that we have of enormous suffering and damage that are behind them. Now, some people have asked why I have not defined practices as being torture in and of themselves. And I want to underline, first and foremost, that cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment is just as prohibited under international law and just as heinous under international law as torture is. Legally, there is no difference in the condemnation that is provided to both categories. But in my dealing with the field of torture, in which I have been working for over 25 years, I've become convinced that there is the necessity to always create a space so that particular forms, and I was going to refer, for example, to rape, need to be provided with a particular sense of condemnation, also that the examination of the context, also the examination of damage, the intentionality, and so on and so forth, and that therefore the dividing line between torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment is one that is important to maintain, as has been ratified by all regional and global institutions. Rashima, you've been a very generous host. I'm very thankful to you. I very much appreciate it. Dear colleagues, I am very, very honored to be here with you today, and of course excited to have called in my appearance before the Human Rights Council for a global ban that I hope will be a reality very soon, so that we can address so much suffering that is happening all around the world. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Victor. Thank you so much for the decisiveness with which you speak about these issues and how fundamentally cruel and inhumane they are. I think it's also an important message that a worldwide ban would require the efforts of so many stakeholders, the medical community, countries, civil society, and faith-based organizations. And in that sense, we all have a part to play. And thank you so much for taking the lead on this. Our next speaker will be Lucas Mendes, the research coordinator at ILGA World. Lucas, ILGA has also focused on unveiling the harms of conversion therapy through a research report, as Victor had mentioned, Curbing Deception. And today also launching a toolbox to combat conversion therapy, which is super important. I wonder if you could give us insight into the findings of the global report.
It'll be my pleasure. Thank you very much, Rashima. So let me share my screen with you. Great. So, well, early this year, ILGA World published Curbing Deception, as Rashima just said. It's a thematic report that we published on the legal regulation of conversion therapy. So even though the focus is, with the legal approach, the report does cover a few other key elements of the issue. So here we have just a brief overview of the content of the report. So in chapter 1, we analyze the terminology that's used generally and colloquially even, and we critically analyze each of the terms that are used generally to refer to efforts to change someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression generally, and we follow the terminology suggested by the APA, including as well sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And in chapter 2, we provide readers with an overview of the many forms that conversion therapies can take and have taken in the past, starting from the late 19th century. In chapter 3, then we provide an overview of the global consensus that we see today, fortunately, thanks to the work of activists, of professional associations, and more recently from human rights organizations. And one of the additions that we will definitely have to add to this chapter when we update it is Victor's report. This has had a huge momentum, so we're really happy to see that this is moving forward. Chapter 4 then covers the overview of proponents. This is a chapter that could be enlarged as well, but we've covered, as it was mentioned by Victor, religious leaders, but also health professionals and state officials in many countries. Chapter 5 collects arguments on the rights at stake. I mean, the legal discussions have been taking place globally regarding both the arguments brought forward by proponents of conversion therapies and arguments brought forward by activists to restrict or ban conversion therapies. In chapter 6, we develop what we call the multifaceted strategy to combat conversion therapies. And as you were saying, Rashima, today we launched the toolbox based on this chapter. So basically that's what I'm going to be focusing on the second part of my presentation. Chapter 7 is like the crux of the report, where we analyze each and every single provision that it's enforced around the world restricting quote unquote conversion therapies. We do that with nationwide legislation and with subnational legislation as well. And we also analyze a few cases. So at least 3 cases in the United States, 2 cases in China, and 1 case in Costa Rica. So in a way, we try to put together everything that has been said and discussed so far in the legal arena in terms of conversion therapies. We had 2 annexes, 2 very interesting annexes. The first one is one in which we have collected position statements by professional associations around the world. And we are pleased to see that it's not like what we call the usual suspects that are included in that list. We see countries in which well, we haven't seen a lot of progress. I mean, from states moving forward in terms of protection of LGBT people on the ground, but several associations have come out to repudiate conversion therapies. So that was something we were proud and happy to find. And Annex 2 is also quite interesting because it's a list of people that used to be prominent proponents and leaders of organizations promoting conversion therapies that have now come out to repudiate conversion therapies, showing all the harm and the lack of evidence that anyone participating in the programs and the activities organized by these organizations had actually managed or succeeded in changing their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So that's a list that could definitely be enlarged. But many of those proponents, sadly enough, were part of campaigns against other rights that have favored LGBT communities on the ground. So we've seen how a few of them were actually presenting themselves as the quote unquote evidence that change was possible. And now they had come out to say, you know what, nothing of that was actually true. And all I've seen in my decades with these organizations is the harms that we've produced, the depression, the anxiety, and even the suicide these practices have caused. So in some cases, not in all cases, but in a few of them, they have even apologized for the harm they produced. So based on chapter 6, so the multifaceted strategy, today we published the toolbox. So this is just a brief overview of the many, many tools that states, organizations, and activists can resort to in order to come up with a multifaceted strategy, multidimensional, comprehensive strategy, if you will. I remember last week when Victor was presenting the report of the council, many states were saying, okay, so we have the legal bans, what else can we do? And I was really eager to press a button, open my mic and say, you know what, we have a toolbox coming up next week. So there's a list of things that you can do, and we will set those out in a way that you can see them clearly. And yeah, just a collection of tools that states can actually implement at the same time, see different strategies that activists can actually bring forward to states' attention, and also a list of key allies. So we have national human rights institutions, the media, and professional associations as key stakeholders that need to be part of a multifaceted strategy. So we have divided tools into the legal tools and the public policy, but this is just a way of classifying the different initiatives. Of course, we won't have time to cover them all, comprehensively as we should. But in the minute that I have left, I just want to point out that none of these, strategies, these tools are sufficient in and of themselves alone. So the strategy that should be thought of in the ground, in terms of coming up with ideas on how to actually curb deception, as we call it in the report, need to rely on several of these at the same time. Not all of them will be relevant to all contexts around the world, especially when we speak to the dialogue, between organizations and religious institutions. That will, surely depend on local contexts, but certainly there is a collection of tools that can be used by stakeholders who are interested in making this something that we read in the books in the future as belonging in the past, eradicating completely the attempts to change someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much, Rashima.
Thank you so much, Lucas. It's great that all of the findings of what you have said and the toolbox that ILGA has come out with, which clearly outlines that there are multiple stakeholders involved, feeds into what Victor was saying, that we need everybody to take a stand and to come forward if we want to move towards a world where there is a global ban on conversion therapies and where all forms of these therapies end. So thank you so much, Lucas. Our next speaker will be Ami Bishop, the Senior Research Advisor at Outright Action International. Ami, you researched and wrote the Outright Report, Harmful Treatment, the Global Reach of So-Called Conversion Therapy, which Victor also mentioned in the report, and which has been seminal in so many ways. And this report drew from survey responses of over 500 people across 80 countries. And I wonder if across all of this research from all around the world, if you had any summarizing points or things that resonated across borders.
Great, thank you so much. I can't tell you how thrilled I am that to be part of this panel, and that in particular that this issue is rising to such a level that we may finally be able to eradicate these practices. Yes, as you noted last year, Outright Action International, we sought to at least preliminarily characterize, really for the first time, the global reach of so-called conversion therapy through, as you mentioned, an extensive literature review, a survey, and also 19 in-depth interviews with survivors from 11 countries. We tried to get a sense of who's most vulnerable, what are the main forms of conversion therapy, and who are the main perpetrators and promoters. We received, among those approximately 500 responses, we received about more than 200 from the Sub-Saharan Africa region, representing 23 countries. From Latin America and the Caribbean, we had respondents representing 18 countries. And in Asia, we had 12 countries represented, but 3/4 of the respondents were from China, so we need to keep that in mind. But here are some summarizing points. So our data suggested that these practices, efforts to repress, change, cure diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, are occurring nearly everywhere in the world. About 2/3 of respondents from Africa believed that so-called conversion therapy was either very or somewhat common, with more than half of respondents from the Latin American and Caribbean region believing the same. Of those we surveyed, about a quarter, 22% of respondents had experienced themselves some form of conversion therapy. And of these survivors, 1/3 of them had sought it out themselves, while 2/3 had been coerced. And in terms of the age, which I think Victor mentioned, the vast majority of people who underwent these change practices were 24 years old or younger in our small sample, with actually a significant portion being between 18 and 24. So what are the drivers? It's been mentioned in our report also reflects this, that religion broadly, faith, was the reason most frequently cited as the driver behind these change efforts, with religious leaders or institutions being the primary promoters and perpetrators in combinations with families. We saw this especially in Africa, in terms of the response from Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. The data from Asian respondents, again, primarily from China, suggested that family honor, so-called, and culture, rather than religion, were the main drivers, with pressure coming from families to seek the paid services of either private or public medical or mental health clinics, where, according to some reports, physically abusive methods such as aversion therapy are predominantly used. These interventions might also be combined with family threats of expulsion from the home, physical abuse, forced incarceration or institutionalization, withholding of school fees, and restrictions on freedom of movement or contact with others. The dominance of religion combined with family pressure was also reflected in the interviews. Many respondents referred to being prayed over, taken for deliverance, being anointed with oils, having to undergo exorcism rituals. Several interviewees described having to fast or dry fast, meaning no food or water for a period of time, combined with intensive prayer as a means of change. Several others voluntarily enrolled or were made to enroll as a condition, for example, to re-enter university, in online religious courses offered through international faith-based groups. These courses led the participants through 12-step-like therapeutic exercises meant to change their sexual orientation or gender identity, or at least to help them resist acting on their so-called same-sex attraction. In some cases, religiously based change efforts became violent and abusive, especially for lesbians and transgender women, where praying rituals devolved essentially into sexual assault. In other cases, religious interventions reportedly are being combined with traditional rituals or secular or professional medical and mental health consultations, especially when it appeared that one type of intervention was not working. Several respondents in sub-Saharan Africa spoke of being subjected to ritual cutting and application of herbs into the wounds, in addition to religious rituals. Not surprisingly, our data supported strong existing evidence that these harmful practices never work and instead cause deep and lasting trauma. Many respondents, particularly through the interviews, spoke of profound feelings of self-hatred, depression, suicidality. Interviewees spoke of feeling dirty and of deep feelings of shame and humiliation and wanting to die, wishing they'd never been born. Tragically, in several cases, interviewees described multiple attempts at suicide. Interviewees also talked about the need, when asked if they had recommendations for how to approach, how to combat these practices. They talked about the need for education and awareness about the harms of conversion therapy, specifically citing the need to target faith-based leaders and institutions, parents, mental health providers. Several noted, importantly, that efforts to address conversion therapy should not be pursued in isolation, of broader efforts, of course, to gain social and religious acceptance and to decriminalize consensual same-sex relations. Interestingly, a significant portion of respondents did not know whether efforts to condemn or ban so-called conversion therapy were occurring in their countries, suggesting that public discourse at this point is very limited, potentially. This is especially striking given that it appears these practices are occurring in some form nearly everywhere. Obviously, this could be due to many issues, including criminalization laws, the taboo nature of discussing queer issues in some contexts. But here, I think we also need to talk about or consider that terminology itself may not exist or is not known. Some of the people I interviewed who were survivors themselves of change efforts were learning for the first time through our documentation efforts that there was a name, or at least a suggested name for what they went through. Lastly, on the point about language, I just want to highlight the need for us as a community to really stay vigilant. Those who remain insistent that change is possible know that the tide is turning against them, and they themselves have long since abandoned terms like conversion therapy. Instead, they're hijacking human rights language to promote their services. They use words like freedom and choice, and they argue that it would be a violation of rights to turn away those seeking help for their unwanted same-sex attractions. So I really believe we ignore these sort of manipulations of language at our peril. I'd like to end with a quote from one of our interviewees from Kenya. They said, quote, "Conversion therapy is not a single event. It is a process of continued degradation and assault on the core of who you are. There are often repeated violations in the form of psychological and sometimes physical abuse. It's not one instance, it's a continued sense of rejection. The pressure is enormous." Thanks so much for the floor.
Thank you so much, Ami, for that rich summary. A few things strike me from what you've said, not least of which is that 1/3 of the individuals themselves or the respondents had sought out conversion therapy itself, and how deeply rooted this is in society's perpetuation of the notion that there are desirable and non-desirable ways of existing, and that religion had played such a large part to individuals who sought out these harmful treatments or were forced into it, and how that highlights the need of the inclusion of faith-based groups in eliminating these practices. It was also very interesting to me that there's a lack of information from Asia, and coming from there, I know that oftentimes this is the case when it comes to many of these issues, but perhaps that's an opportunity to look more into this and actually speaks into the point you made about the lack of language that we have for these issues and the visibility. So thank you so much for those important points. Our next speaker is Florence Pare, who is a jurist and a bioethicist. And Florence, your work on these issues have centered very specifically around trans experiences of conversion therapy and the need for competent care. Could you tell us more about the need to understand trans conversion therapy on its own terms and how this might differ from other experiences of conversion therapy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that human rights can't be protected using a homogenizing lens, and that transconversion therapy really needs to be understood on its own terms rather than by just substituting the word sexual orientation for gender identity, as often occurs, especially by governments. And I think we really need to understand the specificity of transconversion therapy, the changes in the landscape that have been quite specific to transconversion therapy, and the need for gender affirmation and competent care. So the first part, in terms of specificity, there are kind of two elements that really lie at the heart of transconversion practices. The first one is the idea that trans people and transitioning is indicative of mental illness and is something that's less or undesirable, as Victor has spoken to earlier. And the second element, and that one's really important, is the element of gatekeeping. Because of the unique relationship that trans people have with the medical profession, because a lot of trans people want to undergo some sort of medical transition and need to access those services. There's this relationship that can be used as sort of the carrot to keep them and induce them into a relationship with practitioners of conversion therapy. And oftentimes what's going to happen is that they're going to sort of, instead of saying, oh, well, there's absolutely no way you can transition, there's absolutely no way you can be trans, instead they'll kind of use the carrot of, oh, well, you can medically transition if only you jump through this hoop and this hoop and this hoop, and then you kind of end up with an infinite number of hoops and kind of being forced to make impossible efforts not to be trans and not to transition, oftentimes over years, before potentially being allowed to transition. And it's really using a war of attrition. The goal is to really have as few trans people as possible rather than outright disallowing. And the logic is that, well, you don't need to completely disallow people from being trans in your practices if you just completely tire them out and even psychologically abuse them until they go back into the closet. And so we really need to understand this dynamic and how it plays onto aspects of consent, because, you know, as was said, a lot of people go and actively seek out conversion practices, but also a lot of people end up being coerced into conversion practices because they're being promised medical transition, which they want at some point in an eventual future that oftentimes never occurs, only occurs after, you know, like years and years and years of conversion therapy. So that's a huge problem for specifically trans people. We're also seeing that there's a lot of focus on youth because there's this idea that youth are confused and are malleable, which for one is not really true, but also more importantly doesn't change the fact that it's extremely harmful for them. And evidence shows, especially new studies by Jack Turbin, show that conversion practices on trans people that come at a young age are even more harmful, despite the fact that that practitioners are claiming that you know, gender identity is more malleable and at that age. Now, the second aspect is we're really seeing a change in the contemporary landscape of trans conversion practices this year. It's a really huge change where we're seeing talk of gender ideology being used to promote conversion practices in kind of new settings. And this idea that transitioning is anti-women, and as part of this focus on this notion of gender ideology that's used really to, as kind of part of the anti-trans movement, we're really seeing the gatekeeping of the medical community in conversion practices and the gatekeeping of gendered spaces and identity documents kind of be wedded. And we're seeing that in a lot of places where they'll say, well, you have to go through medical transition and get vetted by XYZ medical professional before you're allowed to get your documents. But then they'll kind of encourage those practitioners to do conversion practices. So they're kind of like funneling them into conversion practices, and we'll see a wedding of those gatekeeping approaches. We're also seeing more and more pro-gay and pro-lesbian excuses being used to promote conversion practices, saying that being trans is a social contagion that's impacting, that is turning you know, people who would otherwise be cisgendered and gay or cisgender and lesbian and turning them trans, which is absolutely ludicrous, but helps them promote their own agenda as a progressive agenda that it's, well, quite frankly, not. But at the end of the day, what we really need to keep in mind is that trans people know themselves, and no matter how their life unfolds, telling them that they're wrong in the deepest reaches of their hearts is really a recipe for lifelong shame and harm. And the most important thing to keep in mind in terms of conversion practices is that affirming care is competent care and conversion therapy is not. And that's what I wanted to say today.
Thank you, Florence. One, affirming care is caring care. I'll just repeat that very quickly. But thanks for sharing those particular experiences and for nuancing the conversation. You know, and to your last point also, that trans conversion therapy is very much rooted in the idea that trans people and transitioning are mental conditions, playing into that same narrative of the undesirable and pathologization. But so much of the experiences trans individuals facing conversion therapy, you know, have to do with unethical care from medical professionals who are using gender affirming care or denying it to perpetuate discrimination and exacerbate transphobia. So thank you so much for that. I think it's also really important that you brought in the narrative of gender ideology that echoes what Ami had also said, that there are anti-LGBTIQ actors who are manipulating and using new language to perpetuate old hate. So thanks for that. Our next speaker that we will hear from is Zinar Mohammed, who is the Executive Director of TEARS based in Nigeria. So Zinar, TEARS undertook a 4-month-long national research initiative, I believe at the beginning of this year. Can you talk a bit about your findings and specifically on the prevalence of conversion therapy in Nigeria and also what your organization has since been doing about it?
Hi, Rashima. Thanks for having me. Yes, we undertook a 4-month period where we tried to get in touch with people who self-identified as LGBT to find out how prevalent conversion therapy was. And this was important because, just as Victor mentioned in his introductions, there's an absence of data and knowledge about conversion therapy from sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, and Nigeria particularly. And Nigeria is one of the places that is famous for conversion therapy because we have hundreds of videos, even on the internet, that you can Google of people undergoing conversion therapy, as many religious houses use this as a way to get people to attend their churches because they do miracles like that. So what our research disclosed is not much different from the global survey, and the reports by Lucas, Amy, as the characteristics are largely the same. What the national level research in Nigeria has done is to add nuances and paint a stark picture that is somewhat unique to the Nigerian queer person. So within that 4-month period between January and April 2020, we surveyed over 2,000 LGBTQI identifying persons. And of those numbers, 48.6% had experienced so-called conversion therapies. This was higher than projected numbers, as we can now see that about half of the population who identify as queer have experienced conversion therapy. And of those 51% who hadn't experienced conversion therapy, 35% of them knew someone else who had undergone CT. This is a staggering number of how prevalent it is in the Nigerian society. And of those 35 people who hadn't experienced conversion therapy and knew someone who had, 9.4% of them said that they believed CT worked and that the person was cured. When we probed those persons during discussions, they said that their friends who had undergone it stopped interfacing with other queer people and withdrew from queer activities and functions. This further shows the harm and isolation that conversion therapy causes instead of a cure. This position was also supported by people who had undergone conversion therapy themselves. Only 2% of the 2,000 people polled believed that it had worked and they had stopped being queer. Further insight shows, unsurprisingly, that the most common type of conversion therapy people had undergone was religious rituals, and this was 59% of people. This was followed by physical deprivation, fasting and abstinence, laying of hands, and individual talk therapy at 25%. The perpetrators of conversion therapy were overwhelmingly religious leaders at 47%, while social workers, counselors, psychologists were at 7%. A further 7% was facilitated by general practicing doctors. This was a surprise to us, as this was data that we did not have, that GPs were part of the people who were perpetrating conversion therapy. When we asked who initiated conversion therapy, 1 in 5 persons said they initiated it themselves, while 2 out of 5 were coerced and initiated by parents and family members. A further 10% of therapy was initiated by friends and acquaintances. Family members still believe that being LGBTQI is a disease which has a cure. And this message is coming overwhelmingly from religious groups And the evidence is that the public miracles that they've seen being performed is possible for people in their family. Even queer people who self-initiated conversion therapy said that hearing public testimonies of other queer people at religious events or religious leaders telling them that they had a sickness that could be cured was what led them to initiate conversion therapy. Almost everyone said that they had witnessed or heard about conversion therapy before they initiated CT for themselves. Further analysis of our studies shows that conversion therapy is consistent and usually repetitive, just like the person from Kenya said. Over 50% of people who had undergone conversion therapy were subjected to it multiple times over a period of 6 months to a year. Only 23% of people who had undergone conversion therapy went through it only once. CT also, unsurprisingly, is really practiced by both dominant religions in Nigeria, that is both Islam and Christianity, with both relying on religious texts from the Quran and from the Bible. But even people who practiced both religions were subjected to cultural practices in an attempt to cure them. So even Muslims and Christians still took people who they believed to be LGBTI to go through traditional practices to try and cure them. But the good thing is that it's not all doom and gloom, as there are spaces where we might be able to have allies. From the research, we've seen that the psychiatric arm of medicine in Nigeria showed a very low % of psychiatric doctors practicing conversion therapies. One of our participants actually told us that she was committed to a mental facility after identifying as a woman, but the doctors at the facility ended up being her safe space. They educated her family about gender dysphoria, shared resources with them in the hospital, and the hospital was the first place where actually they started using the right pronouns and her chosen name with her. So this is heartwarming to see that there are people who are actually potentially allies in Nigeria. I think the flip part of that is to see that GPs who have very little training on anything that has to do with SOGI issues are then instead practicing conversion therapies when being referred to by family members. So the next steps of what we're looking at in Nigeria is conducting further research and speaking to religious groups themselves, medical associations, and spaces of learning. We're also building fact sheets about the effects of conversion therapy by queer people themselves, which can be used as a tool to dissuade family members and self-identifying queer people about the harm that CT causes and why people should not be subjected to this kind of torture. Our research will soon be publicly released, and we're hoping that this will strengthen our evidence-based advocacy and the position of LGBTQ organizations here in Nigeria and allies to push for a ban on conversion therapy. We also hope that this will lead to a campaign that will ensure that medical associations speak openly and clearly about the harms of CT and issue guidelines that practitioners must adhere to. Conversion therapy is unlikely to stop today in Nigeria due to the public spectacle surrounding the healings in our spaces of worship. But we do hope that this national level research would be the first step in starting and sustaining a campaign that would lead to the end of conversion therapy here. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that. And I think it's always so important to have local level data about so many of these issues, so we can speak to them from an advocacy perspective in our local contexts. And while it really worries me what you said about the videos being perpetuated online about conversion therapy and being circulated, I hope the recent news that came out from Facebook and Instagram that they'll ban content promoting conversion therapy will be positive. I have my own feelings about Facebook and Instagram, but that's for a different conversation. And I just want to hold on to your message that it is not all doom and gloom, that we can see positive progress happening everywhere, including in Nigeria, where there are professionals who are being affirmative and acting ethically. So thank you so much for that intervention. We now have the pleasure of hearing from two guest interveners. Unfortunately, one of our guest speakers, Tony Briffa, is not feeling well today and therefore cannot join us. But I would like to introduce Gabriela Zavaleta from Más Igualdad, Peru. Gabrielle, I know that your organization also undertook a national level research initiative on conversion therapy. And you also submitted that report to Victor's call for inputs, as well as was able to include information from that report into your submission to the Human Rights Committee, which is excellent in trying to build more research from research. I would just like to ask you if you could talk about the findings of your report and some of your concluding observations.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rashima. Thank you all. And good morning from Lima, Peru. In 2019, Más Igualdad Peru conducted the first exploratory study on mental health practices on LGBTIQ people and the prevalence of conversion therapies in Peru. We did this with the support from the organization Stonewall UK. Through a survey, we reached 323 people and 15 in-depth interviews, and we gathered important data on where LGBTIQ people go in Peru to seek mental health support, what prejudices the mental health professionals have on SOGI issues, and what are the consequences of inadequate support in our mental health and our well-being. We found that 45% of conversion therapies in Peru take place in the public or private practice of mental health professionals, almost always associated with religious faith or pseudoscientific beliefs, and 50% are conducted in religious centers. 6 out of 10 LGBTIQ people that underwent conversion therapies had to go through it when they were children or adolescents. This goes on to prove that families and schools are the main spaces where discrimination and bullying enable for LGBTIQ people, children, to be subjected to conversion therapies. We found a significant association between having undergone these practices and symptoms of post-traumatic stress, which reaffirms that these actions have sustained consequences on mental health. The most frequent form of intervention we found consists of psychotherapeutic techniques, with almost 60%, religious practices such as exorcisms, laying on of hands, and mass in over 10% of the cases, and medical treatments such as hormonal treatment, psychotropic drugs, and electroshock in almost 15% of cases reported. Most alarming is that universities in Peru do not train mental health professionals with an affirmative approach of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity, and they don't include the prevention of discrimination or violence against LGBTIQ people in their curricula. The academia and professional colleagues don't have a strong position against these therapies. With this information, we decided to include our findings in an alternative report that we sent this June to the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations for Peru's upcoming review, in which we highlighted for the first time the impact of conversion therapies in the mental health of LGBTIQ people and the lack of prevention, investigation, and sanction by the government as a symbolic approval of these hurtful actions. This way, our suggested recommendations for the state include enacting legislation that prohibits the practice and promotion of conversion therapies, the adoption of criminal and administrative procedures for reporting, investigating, and sanctioning health practitioners that advertise and execute them, and the promotion of sensitization campaigns for the general public to foster respect and non-discrimination towards LGBTIQ people. Working on this issue and conducting this groundbreaking study require dedicated funding, capable professionals, and committed activists to reach the population we needed to interview and to deliver useful products that we hope will nurture the advocacy activities not only of our organization, but of the LGBTIQ community in Peru as a whole. It is only through our experiences and the information that we can present from them that we can hold our authorities accountable for their lack of action that enables the endangerment of our community. You can find the results of our study in a copy of our alternative report in our website, masigualdad.pe, and contact us for more information. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. I think your findings very much echo Victor's on the experiences of minors with conversion therapy. And again, just warrant me to congratulate Germany on acting in line with human rights standards to ban conversion therapies for those who are under 18. And really on par with your recommendations, I hope that Peru falls in line and does so quickly as well. Our next and last speaker of the day will be Mauro Cabral Greenspan, the Executive Director of GATE. Mauro, it's clear from our prior speakers as well that the LGBTIQ umbrella are impacted by conversion therapy extremely differently, as we specifically heard from Florence too. Could I ask you to share with us how intersex people are affected by conversion therapies?
Thank you very much, Rashima, and to all speakers. It's really fantastic to be here. I would like to start answering your question from a related but different point, which is that this reports and this panel comes in a very needed time when anti-gender organizing around the world is trying to repathologize LGBTI people. And so I wanted to start by saying that when we said that, for example, being trans, as in my case, I'm an intersex and trans person, that when we said that being trans is not a mental disorder, it's not a personal or a political statement, it's a statement that was made by the World Health Organization and affirmed by the World Health Assembly, which is integrated by all health ministers in the world, which means this is a fact and is a scientific fact. Going back to your question, first, intersex people, and being intersex is having been born with sex characteristics that vary from male or female standards. Intersex people have all kinds of gender identities and sexual orientations, and in that regard, many of us are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans people. But particularly, intersex people are subjected to many different normalizing procedures, including surgical interventions and hormonal treatment, whose desired outcome is to ensure that we are going to grow up to be cisgender men and women and straight men and women. In other terms, these interventions have as one of their key goals to ensure that we are not going to be LGBTI people. In that sense, and something that the intersex movement and different experts working on intersex issues have been expressing during the last almost 35 years, is that homophobia and transphobia are at the core of normalizing interventions, and they should be related with conversion therapies. They are focused in ensuring a certain outcome, considering that being an LGBTI person will be related with inferiority, as Victor pointed out. These procedures are usually followed up by a series of related interventions. Some of those interventions have to do with monitoring, for example, what kind of games intersex people engage with in childhood, or what kind of dressing styles we have. For example, my own father has to report to the doctor if after surgery I prefer boys games or girls games, or to dress as a girl or dress as a boy as part of the treatment. In that sense, those interventions are also targeting not only gender identity and gender identity and sexual orientation, but gender expression. And in some cases can include, for example, vaginal dilations in order to ensure that intersex girls will grow up not only to be straight girls, but also to be able to engage in heterosexual intercourse. Finally, and related to the first point, we are seeing that anti-gender organizing coming from far-right organizations, individuals, political parties and groups, and trans-exclusionary radical feminism and religious institutions are using intersex bodies as a weapon against LGBTI people, and particularly against trans people. If we remember that just a year ago, the Congregation for the Catholic Education released a statement called Female and Male, He Created Them, and where that calls, have a different point against LGBT people. Intersex people there are identified as people being born with malformations that deserve pity, but that they are also entitled to have medical interventions to normalize their bodies as soon as possible in life. So in that sense, where we are seeing that there is a call to repathologize intersex bodies and to consider intersex people in need of correction, which in this case is connected with conversion therapies, as a way of attacking other communities, which is an extreme perverse instrumentalization of intersex lives and bodies. Finally, to close this intervention, I applaud the initiative presented by the German government, and all initiatives aim to ban conversion therapies. But the only way of banning them to a full extent is to include a ban on medically unnecessary and personally unconsented interventions on intersex bodies. Only if we get that, our world will be free of conversion therapies for all. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mauro, for that extremely important intervention. And I think that I will just echo what you last said, which is the only way we can reach a total ban on conversion therapies is if we also have a ban on medically unnecessary interventions on intersex bodies. And that what we see now is a call to repathologize intersex bodies and trans people and LGBTIQ people, and something that we need to work very much against. And the last thing I will echo from what you have said is that trans people do not have a mental disorder. This is not a political statement. This is a fact, and it's a scientific fact. And I think that very much speaks clearly to what Florence was saying as well. I would just like to thank all the speakers of today so very much for your rich discussion and intervention and providing so much nuance to this conversation. I would like to now open the floor to any states who might have an intervention. And if you could raise your hand, I should have said that. That would be helpful so we can identify you. All right, I will take it that for this moment that we do not have any state interventions from the floor. I will then look for any open questions. Also, this is my first time looking at this question and answer, so give me a second. Any of my other technical hosts who are in the background, if you could jump in, this would be great.
We have actually a show of hands from Iceland.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, and I think, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Just wanted to say thanks for the event, which was very useful in the same way that your other event this week was. But I think the the thanks also go to the independent expert for bringing this topic to the council, which I think was very appreciative, as well as the very helpful summary that he put to us, which at least in my case, I sent home as for information. I wanted to ask on this concept of global ban. I think when it comes to conversion therapy, I think at least for some states, there might be the issue of conversion therapy or elements of conversion therapy being banned. But I think there are countries that are now taking that extra step to ban it outright, as we have heard from Germany. How do you, maybe to the independent expert as well as the panel, how do you see us moving forward from here? What is the next step? What does a global ban mean? Because I can see an advocacy effort. I can see us using this report as well, both states and civil society, to push for an outright ban domestically for conversion therapy. But I'm interested in hearing what a global ban or an approach to ban it more systematically globally would look like. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Victor, would you like to take this one?
Of course, Ashima. Thank you very much for the question. I appreciate it. One of the things that it's important in relation to what my mission is and my mandate is that, of course, my business is the business of state responsibility. And therefore, I always focus on the tools that are of the core, at the core of state action. And they usually relate to legislation, public policy, or access to justice. And so when I examined good and best practice in relation to this, I was very much examining what are the examples that we have around the world, the type of legislative bans, which might be wide or recipient-specific, provider-specific, the public policies that surround them, and also the type of judicial action that can be carried out in relation to this. And I very much like not only the body of evidence that is presented in this event around the screen, but very importantly, also the type of solutions that have been discussed by different panelists. And this toolbox that is now out there and that is exemplifying some of these types of action, but also some that are not specifically and only relating to states, which is, of course, a wider field of action. So in all of this, I think that what we are trying to do is to look at good and best practice and to provide advice to states on what seems to work and what seems to work best in relation to this. A couple of things in this connection is, of course, it's very clear when we look at legislation, what should be the elements there, probably also in relation to public policy, but I want to focus a little bit in relation to access to justice, because this is important. The action of justice will be fundamental in creating an examination of specific cases and the particular instances that we're looking at, the examination of pain, damage, and measures of redress. And of course, as part of the measures of redress will be, I believe, very important, all of those that relate to non-repetition, which is the evaluation of a judge as to what are the conditions that have allowed in a particular setting the existence of the violation. So all of these are, in a way, tools that exist, right? And I think Lucas was very much spot on when he said that in their view, not one specific tool will be the one actually doing the trick, but a combination. Now, a couple of things in relation to this to complete my answer is, there is a well-defined framework for cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment under international law. And I don't think that we need to be misled or confused by the fact that sexual orientation, gender identity issues have been taboo for so long in societies, so that these appear to be emergent issues. Cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment have a vigorous, very solid framework under international law. And when you look at the forms of conversion therapy or practices that I've been referring to, they all fall squarely within that definition. One of the things related to in my report was, of course, the voices of persons that came and expressed worry about their own lives as persons who, for some degree or another, experience unwanted same-sex attraction. Amy Bishop referred to this. I want to establish very clearly, freedom lies at the base of everything that we defend. Freedom, autonomy, and dignity lie at the base of everything that we defend, and there is zero contradiction between the idea of freedom, autonomy, and freedom from violence and discrimination. Zero. Anybody who purports that that's the case is actually misleading the audience. What is not possibly the case is to claim that, first of all, there needs to be any therapeutic approach to this because there is nothing to cure. And second, there is zero evidence that conversion, so to speak, is possible. So those are two very different things. My report, as I say it squarely, does not cover any form of support that a person freely seeks to actually affirm a particular way in which they want to exercise freedom. And I think within these boundaries is where we find a very strong framework where states can take action to eliminate these heinous practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor, for all of that, but also how powerful you were in talking about freedom from violence and for bodily autonomy. I would like to now give the floor to Florence, who I know has indicated that she would like to say something, and then maybe we can have a last round of responses from the rest of the speakers.
Yes, so I want to address perhaps the little bit more kind of practical nitty-gritty aspect, and I think one thing that's important to take note of is also the important symbolic and pedagogical aspect of laws, because that can guide how laws are drafted. In my research, because I've researched a lot, the legal regulation of conversion therapy, including working on model laws, and I'm currently working on a manuscript, a book on the topic that I'm happy to share with anyone who just emails me about it. But taking note of the symbolic and pedagogical aspects of the issue of conversion therapy highlights the need for clarity and detail in approaches to it, because a lot of the effect of law, especially in the professional world, is in educating providers and educating people who are vulnerable to conversion practices. And it's really important to highlight that aspect, and also to add support to those aspects through education programs, and also support for survivors. So that's just a little thing that I wanted to add on the topic.
Thank you so much, Florence. I think at this point we have very much run out of time. If we have any last words, I maybe can include them. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your participation today. Thank you very much, speakers, for giving us your time, your insight, and for doing the valuable work of visibilizing these issues. I think it's very clear from the conversations that we had today are that these harmful practices have been discredited on multiple grounds, that they very much are perpetuated by transphobia, homophobia, anti-gay sentiments, and that, you know, today we see new narratives attacking the same old issues of what we or what society perpetuates as normal or what should be normal, and really the diversity that really exists in this world and in this humanity. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time today. And this side event has been recorded, so you can come back to this at a later time, and Ilga will be sharing the link. Thank you once again.